In this episode of the Podmaster, we're going to talk about Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and search, and the myths and truths surrounding them. Alright, I'm going to tell you the truth because there's a massive chasm between what is the actual truth and what platforms like Apple Podcasts and Spotify want you to know. And there's a very good reason for that. They don't want you to know the actual truth because then you could game it. So let's get into how Apple Podcasts works because, of course, they are still the number one platform for podcast consumption in the world. And as much as Spotify and their PR games would like to convince you that actually Spotify are the number one, and then YouTube are doing the same as well, of course, we're the number one podcast app in the world. No, you're the number one video app that happens to have podcasts on it. But we're not going to get into that. That's for another episode. So how does it actually work? Well, here's what Apple Podcasts will tell you is the system that controls search within their app. And I know this because I can quote it from their own website. Here is that quote. Search finds the best possible match to your search term and presents the most relevant results at the top. Some of the main factors that Apple Podcasts uses to order your search results includes metadata. In other words, the show name, the channel name, and the episode title. Popular podcasts with large followers and plays in Apple Podcasts user behavior. Podcasts with high engagement, such as those that are played or followed from search results. So yeah, you're much more likely to get surfaced in the search results for any term because of that. So that's kind of what they're saying publicly. That's how this works. And they say that, like with the charts, ratings, reviews, and shares help indicate a podcast's newness, popularity, and quality, but they're not factored into search results. Well, first of all, I can tell you right now, we know that's a lie. We absolutely know that's a lie because it's very unlikely that you'll have a podcast that will enter the charts that won't get some fringe benefit in search rankings. You can quote me on that, take it to the bank, as they used to say in lots of 80s movies. And if anybody from Apple Podcasts is actually listening to this right now, I'm sorry, but I am calling you out. You are lying. And you lie about pretty much everything because, again, you don't want us to game your system. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Quality control is a good thing. And they had a problem with this around 4 or 5 years ago where people worked out that if you could just literally get 3 new followers per day on your podcast within Apple Podcasts, that was enough to get you in the charts, certainly in the top 150. And so they put a stop to that algorithm. They turned it off, but they didn't entirely turn it off. So let me tell you exactly how Apple Podcasts search ranking works because it is the number one podcasting app. Spotify works similarly, but this advice I'm giving you right now specifically relates to Apple Podcasts. The title and the author fields, absolutely, those are determining factors in how your search results will play out. However, it's not the whole story. The metadata is just one part of the puzzle. We do know that podcasts with a lot of followers will get preferential treatment from Apple Podcasts in search results. We know this because we've seen the data. Lots of it. I mean, across several shows. I've spent numerous hours in spreadsheets crunching the numbers. And we've seen podcasts. And when I say we, I'm not just talking about me. I don't just mean my clients and my podcasts. I'm talking about all the people I've spoken to, networked with, and had friends that have massive podcasts with lots of followers. And the absolute difference is that these people are making in terms of their results in their podcast journey is they've got loads of followers. It's an absolute fallacy to believe that a podcast with 10,000 followers is going to be treated exactly the same as a brand new podcast that has 3 followers. Are you mad, Apple Podcasts? You think we're all going to believe that? That's just not how it works at all. So your number one goal, if you want to get ranking in search, yeah, you need to be thinking about your SEO. All the keyword optimization stuff that I've been wanging on a daily basis on not only LinkedIn, but on here as well, on this podcast, and all the other social media channels, and my website blogs, God knows where else, YouTube, Reddit, Quora, wherever we've been talking about this stuff. Yes, massively, fundamentally, it's important to make sure you get those keywords fed in through your podcast metadata, like a delicious podcasting peacock. However, that's not the full story. You also want to be thinking about your description. Okay, Apple Podcasts don't want you to know this, but certain podcasts that have reached a certain level, the description does factor into where they're ranked in search. I'm telling you this, and they're going to hate me for telling you this, but it's true. And the whole point of this podcast is to bring you the truth of the podcasting industry. But they don't want this out there because it could be gamed. If people just stop wanging out 2 sentences in their show descriptions, in the episode descriptions and all that, then everyone's going to be competing on a level playing field. And they don't want that. They want podcasts that make more effort with their episode descriptions and with the SEO, because that usually parallels with a better quality show. And they want these podcasts getting better results because, frankly, they don't want your crap podcast getting found. Also, you're probably not in a relationship with them. You're not connected to them directly. You're not doing the work. You're not going behind the scenes and doing all that whining and dining stuff that the people at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, previously Google Podcasts, and now YouTube Music want you to do. They do have certain relationships they strike up with preferential people. I know this because I've had the conversations with other podcast agency owners. We all know about the famous Apple Podcast dinners. So here's what you need to be thinking about, because you don't have a budget to spend thousands and thousands of pounds on taking rich executives out for dinner. If you want to crack SEO in podcasting, you want to make sure that you've got at least 3 keywords nailed down that you know your episode could rank for in search. Let me give you an example. If I wanted to rank this episode in search within Apple Podcasts, what am I going to be doing? I'm going to be saying Apple Podcasts, SEO, SEO in podcasting, podcasting SEO. I'm then going to put all that in my keyword research tools, and I'm going to see what comes back to me in search of volumes of traffic and how that kind of content is ranked. I can then apply that to my title on my podcast episode. And you'll see how that's worked out when you look at the title of this episode. You know, the bit at the top where you give absolutely no thought whatsoever to it when you're publishing your own episodes. Yeah, you need to do a little bit more research than that. That is the difference maker between a podcast that does really well in search and a podcast that just whacks out content episode after episode and gets about 3 downloads per week. I mean, of course, none of that matters really, because if you're getting the right audience, it doesn't matter how many downloads you get. But what you need to be thinking about, if you want to get more reach and visibility, is how your episode is going to be ranked. How will Google see it? How will Apple Podcasts see it? How will Spotify see it? By all means, do a bit of research and see what other podcasts have used in terms of specific keywords in their past episodes. Try and do a bit of spying. See what worked. See what didn't work. Make sure that when you're writing your episode description, again, you're getting those same keywords in there. And here's why. An absolute blast of an idea for you to start doing today. Not only does Apple Podcasts start indexing your episode descriptions once you reach a certain point, but also they've got their automatic transcription going on behind the scenes that you're not supposed to know about. They don't want you knowing about it, because how else do you think they're indexing the bigger podcasts? Because they've got auto transcription. And sometimes, if you're smart enough to really take this seriously and you invest in SEO tools for podcasting, like, I don't know, perhaps that #1 podcast SEO tool at the moment, Voxelize, which shows you the keywords that are showing up for your episodes and some of those keywords that are coming up that weren't coming up last month. But the auto transcription gets it a little bit wrong sometimes. I'll give you a real world in the wild example. I run point on a show for a client. It's called The Weenie Cast, and it's for ADHD entrepreneurs and neurodivergent business owners. The host, Katie McManus, will often make a reference to ADHD-preneurs. But sadly, the Apple Podcasts auto description device sometimes thinks that's actually a French word and is spelt with an accent. Preneur. So obviously it doesn't get it right all the time, and this is why you need to be putting more effort into your episode descriptions so you can actually start tailoring your content, as in that thing there that you hear within the sound of my voice in your ears. That thing then more closely matches the content that you're writing for your episode descriptions, so it all tallies up together. It's all married in a delicious podcasting civil ceremony. Then Apple Podcasts can look at it and go, oh yeah, I know exactly what this podcast episode is about now. Spotify, very similarly, but slightly different, in that they're actually factoring in interaction now. And you'll find that interaction tab in the Spotify for Podcasters dashboard. If you've not got yourself set up with that yet, do it today. You can then ask questions directly relating to your episodes and do Q&As and polls. Like, for example, on this episode, I could say, poll, is Neil a dickhead? Yes or no? When you're starting to get that engagement in Spotify for Podcasters, you might notice that your ranking within Spotify is going to increase as well. Now, of course, all of this is very useful if you're simply relying on organic search to get your podcast listeners. But we do know, as professional podcast experts, that there is a better way of getting guaranteed listeners. And we'll be covering that in a future episode of the Podmaster. But for now, at least we've given you something to work on when it comes to getting more organic listeners finding your show within the podcast apps. Encourage new followers, which will help with your ranking visibility. Create content that they actually want to listen to, which will mean that they'll listen longer, signaling to Apple Podcasts and Spotify that it is a show worth surfacing in the search results. And put more thought and effort into the metadata, show notes, descriptions, and keywords you're going to use in your future episodes. Good luck, and let me know how it goes. Stats, those all-important stats. Yes, we know stats don't matter. Every podcast expert on the planet will tell you this, but you don't care. You still have those vanity metrics in mind. You want to know how your podcast download numbers compare with the rest of the world's. So here are the official IAB certified stats that you need to be aiming for if you want to hit certain percentile rankings within the podcasting space. As in, not the crap that Listen Notes gives you. If you want to call yourself a top 50% podcaster, you'd better be getting 145 downloads per episode per month in your RSS feed. If you want to be a top 30% podcaster, that number climbs significantly. 500 downloads for your latest episode within a month is what you're looking for. Top 20% podcaster? Are you getting 1,200 downloads per episode per month in the podcast apps? Are you? If not, you're not a top 20% podcaster. Are you calling yourself a top 10% podcaster on all your social media and on your website? Well, then you best be seeing 3,200 downloads on your latest episode within 30 days. Top 5% podcasters getting 7,500 downloads per episode per month. Top 2% podcasters, 17,000 downloads per episode per month. And those top 1% podcasters are getting 28,000 downloads within each episode within a month. Want to ignore the vanity metrics and get real-world results from your podcast? Book yourself one of my popular podcast audits. You can book one now at podmastery.co/audit. That's podmastery.co/audit. Recently, I've been hosting LinkedIn Live audio events where I not only give out podcasting advice and insights, but also invite listeners to post questions for me. And in this particular episode of the LinkedIn Live, we had John Ball asking a question.
You're talking about primarily SEO with the episode descriptions, which is great. How important is that in like the show name and the episode titles?
Massively important. So let's go a little bit deeper into this then. So the algorithm that everyone pretty much in podcasting, the OGs, the current up-and-comers, everybody that's ever done any sort of podcast strategy will tell you there are two levels to it. You've got your main show title and you've got your main show author field. Now those are supposedly the determining factors of how a podcast is found in general search. And then, of course, we know it breaks down then to episodes. So when you search, certainly now with Apple Podcasts, with the update they've done to it, it's now got a slightly different front end, where before it was breaking things down. The top half of the screen was your podcasts, and then the bottom half of the screen was the podcast episodes. Now it breaks it down into a filter. So you've now got top performing shows, top podcasts for that search result, top episodes for that search result. So it's broken down in three ways now. But what I would say to you is that most people are probably going to be looking at the top, say, 10 results. So if you want your show to be one of those results, then ideally what you need to be doing is absolutely spending a lot of time on your show description, the show name. I cannot stress this enough. The show name is quite possibly one of the most important things that you can ever do for your podcast. Show artwork is very much up there. It's a very close second or third. But your show title, if you get that wrong, you're going to find you're struggling from day one to find your ideal listeners. Unless you've got a huge following on social media, which you can then draw on 1% of to help you grow your podcast. But yeah, fundamentally, you're looking at putting in more effort into your show description before you even start thinking about your episode descriptions.
Awesome.
Was that it?
Well, this is why I follow you, Neil. I get the best advice in podcasting from you, mate.
Well, that's it for another episode of the Podmaster. Thank you so much for listening to me wanging on for the last 16 minutes or so. And if you enjoyed this podcast episode, no prizes for guessing what I'm going to ask you to do now, right? Considering I talked about the importance of it earlier on in this episode. Give us a follow in Apple Podcasts or Spotify or whatever other podcasting app you might choose to listen to this in. I'm not fussy. I just want your delicious follow. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll speak to you next time on the Podmaster. And remember to sign up to get more tips at podmastery.co. The Podmaster is a Podnose podcasting production. Find out more about us at podnose.co.uk. That's podknows.co.uk. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Podmaster podcast. The fact that you've listened this far tells me you got something out of the episode. Want to get more free tips and insight on how to improve your podcast? Each email will contain insightful, valuable, actionable tips that you can apply to your podcast today to get closer to Podmastery. Sign up now at podmastery.co. That's podmastery.co.